Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. When I hear the name Hearst, I instinctively think of William Randolph Hearst, the media magnate that owned the New York Journal. He also had a long political career fueled by opportunism. William Randolph Hearst became a key personality in American society, from the sensational journalism of the Spanish-American War in 1898 to the age of cinema. He died after World War II. The film Citizen Kane is even based on William Randolph's life. But as intriguing as he is, his father, George Hearst, was as interesting. He was a wildcat prospector turned politician, and in many ways he was the inspiration for his son. The biographies of William Randolph Hearst still attest to this, and family stories about George have made it to press. But until now, there's been no modern scholarly biography of George Hearst. And we need one, because George Hearst is emblematic of the American West in the Gilded Age. I submit that there could have been a movie based on his life, because he has the tenacity of Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood. He crossed paths with the outlaws and sheriffs of Deadwood, and his political career had the feel of a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, although far less virtuous than Jimmy Stewart. But more, his love affair and marriage to Phoebe Apperson connects George with major social movements of the 20th century, because after his death, Phoebe used their great wealth to fund feminist and suffragist causes. I talked today with Matthew Bernstein about his new book, George Hearst, Silver King of the Gilded Age. Bernstein is professor of English at Los Angeles City College, and in his own words, has been living with George Hearst for more than a decade. The book has all the telltale signs of that. It's a thick, descriptive biography that brings readers in touch with the correspondence and controversies that surround this intriguing character. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be here.
William Randolph Hearst is where I start my thinking about the Hearsts, but George Hearst, what your book has shown me is that he looms really large, not only in the consciousness of his son, but also in the consciousness of the United States at this time. And biography brings us pretty close with our subject. I was wondering if you could just give me an overview. Just tell us who George Hearst is and why he's so important to the Gilded Age.
Oh, certainly. Well, George Hearst didn't exactly have a rags to riches story, because he grew up in Missouri Territory just before it was granted statehood, and they were actually fairly affluent for the time, his family. They owned 3 small farms, and he says that I was actually more of my mother's boy. His father liked to go to parades, and he was really civic-minded, and he was kind of a rough and tumble guy. And Hearst first got interested in mining when he went with his father to a French lead mine. And he saw that these Frenchmen could afford a lot nicer things than the Hearst family could with their farms. Hearst saw that, okay, there's more money to be made through mining than farming. And he has a very patchy education. It's one of those log cabin stuff that every so often he spends a few weeks here and a few weeks there, and goes and stays with an aunt in St. Louis and gets a little bit more of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Decides on his own that he's going to enroll in a mining school outside of Franklin County, where he lives, and decides really that's going to be his passion. And he says at one point in a 40-page memoir he writes at the end of his life that I have confined myself to mining since I was 21 years old. Everything else is incidental. And really, that was his focus in life. It's what got him what he wanted, but it was his passion. And George Hearst, he became the greatest miner in American history. He went to California during the gold rush, made and lost fortunes, made his first killing in the Comstock lode in Virginia City, which was then Nevada Territory, lost fortunes, rebuilt his empire through a silver mine outside Salt Lake City, ultimately went to Deadwood, got the greatest gold mines in the Black Hills, became the greatest copper king through Anaconda Copper in Montana Territory, and formed this empire, then turned into a United States senator, had this illustrious career, and yet was always this horny-handed guy who liked greasy food and bacon and pork and beans, and was kind of an outsider in the US Capitol because no one exactly knew what to make of him. Everyone else was, like Yale and Harvard educated. And here was George Hearst with this high-pitched Southern accent and, didn't read the same books that they did, if, he read them at all. And of course, he also had this genius son and this genius wife, both of whom were so much more cultured than he was.
So how does he navigate that life between being really rich? I mean, his riches are going to stretch on for generations, right, within his family, to then also wanting to have this sort of refined cultural lifestyle where he's respected in Washington or New York. How does that play out in his life?
Well, he seemed to have an appetite for more and more wealth. In a manner, it seemed that he was a very competitive person. Now, a lot of people have looked at the movie There Will Be Blood and, have made like, oh, was this based on George Hearst? And no, it wasn't exactly based on George Hearst because George Hearst wasn't exactly personally murdering people. But he did have a competitive spirit. So it might not have actually been that he wanted bigger and larger houses. It's just that he really wanted to win the game, and then he had to put his money somewhere. He spent a lot of time in horse racing in his later years, and he bought the most expensive horse that had been bought, King Thomas, for $40,000. No one had offered more for a horse since Richard III, my kingdom for a horse. But it was the gamesmanship of it. He kind of like wanted to win the game of horse racing. I would say that it was the competitive spirit that drove him more than the need for largesse.
That's really interesting. I think that certainly is the enduring profile that comes out of this from birth to death. The other thing that comes out of it is your biography, that is that he doesn't really take bankruptcy too seriously, or it's as if like, when he loses a fortune in one of his disastrous mining plans, it's not like the end of the world. Whereas I know if I lost millions, I would be beside myself. I wouldn't know what to do. One of his enduring characters seems to be a resilience that not many people have. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, certainly. Now, speaking of Gilded Age, I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Twain's The Gilded Age. And, one of the themes in that book is you lose a fortune and then you make a fortune. And especially with mining in that time period, there was the ability to do so. One of Malcolm Gladwell's books actually focused on sort of time periods that were sort of like sweet spots when you could make fortunes. And the Gilded Age is one of those. Now, Hearst could find himself $100,000 in debt and be like, all right, all I have to do is go find a new paying mine. And sometime it would take him years, and there were disasters. At one point, one doesn't think of William Randolph Hearst living in a boarding house, but they lost their fortune in the early 1870s. And little Willie and Phoebe had to like live with mom and dad and were bouncing between a boarding house. And George was out there in the Wild West and in the mines, like desperately seeking another fortune, and ultimately finds one. But he always seemed to have an unshakable belief in his abilities. And even when he was down and out, other miners recognized that George Hearst had sort of like he had a natural nose for gold. Like he was one of those people, and everyone who was a miner at the time wanted this ability that he could look at a hillside, he could look at a mountain, and he could tell you what was in it. He could tell you what it constituted. And he was considered the best in the business, and he ultimately proved it.
Yeah, your book did a wonderful job of explaining how he found quartz veins and kind of gravitated towards them, which other miners weren't doing. And I think the other thing that really didn't surprise me about him, but really made me think that this was a kind of person that I wouldn't mind being around, is the harem of friends that he winds up, having around him. So Mark Twain, you mentioned, he's one of them, that him and Twain strike up a relationship. I mean, is Hearst magnetic, and is he as much like a metal prospector as he is a social prospector?
Ha. He had what people called a good vein of humor. And later in life, like he met Mark Twain in Virginia City about 1863. And they were both boys from Missouri who made good. And later in life, Mark Twain and he reunite in New York City and Hearst Mansion in Washington, D.C. And Twain, of course, loves to go over there because, you're going to get the best food. There's going to be a big party. And George will take you, if he likes you, down into the basement and smoke cigars and drink bourbon with you. And of course, he's going to do that with Twain. Twain at the time was actually more of, what'd you call a social prospector than George was, because Twain at about, I want to say 1887, he had lost his fortune through that ridiculous typesetter machine that never quite functioned. And he poured all of his money into there along with his own publishing business. Did really well initially, was able to publish Sherman and Grant's memoirs, some of his own books, but it ultimately failed. Whatever the case, he comes to Twain for a small loan. And no one knows exactly how much George gave him, but George does explain to a number of people, with these loans that he would always give people, that they didn't strike it lucky. That could have been me, so I should divide. Now, he always manages, back to your question, to get terrific talent around him. If it's a mining manager or if it's cattle ranches, he is a sociable guy that people gravitate to, even without the fact that, he can loan you money or buy you dinner, because he's actually very affable. And he was able to, for a guy who sometimes didn't seem to be the brightest, who could oftentimes put his foot in his mouth, he was able to attract people like Phoebe, his wife, who was a smarty pants and a teacher and, a wonderful human being. His son, who was, say what you want about William Randolph Hearst, he was a linguistic genius. His son must have looked up to him like he was some sort of god. Here's a guy who just came from almost nothing, out there in the outskirts of Missouri, and, was able to rise so spectacularly high. George Hearst didn't initially win an election to become United States Senator. He was appointed by the governor because everyone seemed to agree he should be, despite him having almost no experience with politics. And he ultimately learned to play the game, and people wanted him, at least from the Democratic side, to succeed.
There's just so much about his life that seems to reverberate with the times, and also the geography of the U.S. at this time as well, and the sectionalism that's playing out. I mean, you mentioned at the outset that he was from Missouri. You also mentioned that he was a senator from California. Of course, he's going to settle in Washington as a senator, really. I mean, he kind of represents all parts of the country. I mean, how did he feel about the big sectional debates and divides that were still going on in Reconstruction and Gilded Age America?
Oh, there's a number of issues I can talk about where he put his foot down. He was oddly an environmentalist. He did believe in preserving the California forests. Once he was appointed senator, that was one of his jobs. He used hydraulic mining initially, which was bad for the environment, and then came out against it later. Now, some of his politics were backwards, and that is my least favorite part of his character. He was for the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, which he wasn't a part of, which essentially made it so that it was difficult to immigrate to the country, and that if you were a Chinese woman attempting to get here, you had to marry an American man. it became more draconian, and Hearst lent his vote to this, where I think it was about 1886, maybe 1887, 20 to 30,000 Chinese Americans abroad were stranded. They passed this law that they could not come back to the United States. So Hearst had some very backwards ideas that his wife was not in favor of at all, which must have made for some difficult dinner conversations. At the same time, he could be forward thinking. He did go up against Leland Stanford in the Senate and say that your trains cannot privatize property when they're running through property. Mind you, the property Hearst was talking about was lands with mineral rights, which of course he was interested in. But he was able to go against people. There was also a scheme, I'll say it was a scheme created by William Stewart, who was a senator from Nevada, and a few other people that wanted to divide Idaho territory, didn't want it to become a state. They wanted to divide it between Washington and Nevada so that Nevada would become much larger and Washington state would become much larger. And Hearst was one of the people who put his foot down on that said, actually, the argument that they were making that it couldn't sustain itself as a state because there wasn't any agricultural potential there. Hearst had gone through the West probably more than any other man, going through various mining camps, which people recognized. And so when he said on the floor of the Capitol building that no, there is potential for agriculture, there are wonderful valleys in Idaho, that shot down the scheme. And then, of course, an enterprising prospector planted some potatoes in Idaho, and the rest is history.
And I mean, one of the things that Hearst seems to have is the same thing that William Randolph Hearst had, which was this opportunistic politics rather than ideological. I mean, he doesn't strike me as a politician that is all about big ideas, but rather one that is thinking about how it might benefit him and maybe in some cases his constituents. I mean, is that something that you think we can draw a parallel from George to Little Willie on?
Oh, certainly. Hearst politics were what was good for Hearst. Now, on a personal level, he could be extraordinarily generous and people recognized at them. But he, like his son, really wanted everything. There's a quote in there by William Randolph Hearst where he suggests to his father that they just buy up Mexico and run it for themselves. And that did seem to be the Hearst way. You know, like when he gets a hold of the Black Hills, you know, there's like 40 lawsuits or so against him. You know, everyone is trying to push him out. He's not, you know, like he's seen as an invader. And his strategy, once he cannot win certain mines through lawsuits, is like, fine, I'll just buy it outright. I'll buy out the owners. It did seem that George Hearst's political ambitions were hobbled by the fact that he died at the age of 70. But had he kept going, he was going to do everything he could to keep going. And his son had the same sort of mentality, you know, like William Randolph Hearst became a congressman in New York. He ran for mayor of New York. He ran for governor of New York. He ran for the presidency. You know, he really attempted to take control of everything. And, you know, at one point in time, William Randolph Hearst owned like 1/5 of all of the like medieval art worlds. You know, he was this massive collector, and he couldn't fit it all in his in Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California. So he would have warehouses in New York just filled with his stuff because he wanted more. Now, obviously, he looked at how his father operated and felt, okay, this is the way to do things. And when George Hearst died, George Hearst was worth $20 million. Now, a year or two after he died, that had blossomed to $40 million because the mines were still paying. William Randolph Hearst created what would now be considered a multi-billion-dollar industry through his newspapers, through his media, through radio shows and magazines and movies. But he was a chip off the old block. The idea was to gobble up as much as you can, and we are the Hearsts, and this is what we have. Now, contrary to that, Phoebe Hearst was appalled at the way her son operated. And she was much more generous and humble. Now, she was also, she became the first regent of UC Berkeley, which the Hearsts had put a lot of money into building. But she didn't have such ambitions as, to have such largesse.
It's interesting to think about Hearst's lifestyle and his I suppose his business, his desire to gather everything, as you said, and to consume and to build this empire, and then also his family life, because it seems so different. On one hand, he's not really spending a whole lot of time with his wife and his kids because he's constantly traveling around trying to prospect, and his life seems consumed by that. And he also seemed to sue to keep his prospects alive. It seems like he was lawyering up all the time. So if he's spending all this time suing and prospecting, how does the family life play out?
Well, little Willie was a handful as a child. And I am absolutely certain that George felt, I'd rather go to a mining camp with all my cronies and have a lot of fun and, maybe visit some saloons than spend a lot of time changing diapers and telling little Willie he can't be throwing bricks through windows, or pretending the house is on fire so that the firemen will come and, he can have his big April Fool's Day laugh. George didn't want to be part of that. So he was escaping some of the time as well, and having fun on these business trips. As a father, he did spank his child on occasion. He was the one that really believed that, like, Willie has to learn that life isn't just one great big laugh, that he's got to have a little bit of discipline in him. But George was also a soft touch when his son was concerned, and William Randolph Hearst wanted to take over his father's newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, that George had bought to kind of help propel him in politics. He was looking to be governor at the time and bought the paper in 1880. George didn't want little Willie to take over the Examiner, thought it was what he called a quartz mine and would never pay. But he really couldn't say no to his son, and when it turned out that the kid in 1 year had spent $140,000 on the Examiner, which was extraordinary, especially for the money back then, and only $47,000 on himself did William Randolph Hearst splurge. George wasn't terribly bothered by it. He had other things on his mind, and he kind of knew that he had enough money that they could stand it.
You mentioned the story about April Fools. I wonder if you'd share with the listeners that story from the book, because it seems to really show us what the dynamics were like in that family.
I'll tell you a couple William Randolph Hearst anecdotes from back in that time. I'll get to the April Fools one. My favorite part of the William Randolph Hearst story as a youngster is he's in Harvard, and he does a couple things that everyone is shocked by. He has a girlfriend, and you're not supposed to have a girlfriend at the time. You are supposed to marry a nice young lady or discreetly visit prostitutes, but you can't actually have like a girl like around that, Tessie Powers was her name, and she was a Cambridge waitress, and this was shocking to people. And along with having Tessie, he also had a pet alligator named Champagne Charlie that he allowed to drink alcohol. So here's this kid from California, and he's walking around Harvard with his girl and his pet alligator. And of course, this is shocking to everybody. He's also throwing pies at chorus girls in, vaudeville shows. He's vandalizing property. He's having a ball. He also takes over the Harvard Lampoon, which is their small literary magazine, and he expands it from 4 pages to 8 pages. He plays Pretzel in a burlesque show that his friend Ernest Thayer writes, and Ernest Thayer will later write Casey at the Bat for Hearst's Examiner. He's just a remarkable guy that you love from a distance, but as a teacher, you would never want this kid in your class. April Fool's prank happens years earlier, rather, when Hearst might be like around 8 at the time, or William Randolph Hearst. And it's San Francisco, and George and Phoebe are remodeling their house. So they're actually staying with some friends in San Francisco. And Willie thinks it would be great fun if he sets fire to his own room that he's staying in. And then, he's shouting fire, and there's smoke pouring out, and people can't get in. The door seems locked. Oh my God, young Willie is going to burn to death. So they call the firemen, and the big hose gets sent in and drenches little Willie and puts out the fire, and he's having so much fun. And he explains to Mom, like, oh, it was just a prank. And Phoebe isn't mad at him because she's so happy that her darling son is fine. And, George has to deal with it. And he says, were you very warm when the fire was going on, son? And Willie looks up at Dad and says, no, Papa, I wasn't hot at all. And George says, well, you're going to be warm now, kid, where it's going to do you the most good. And he turns him around and he spanks him several times.
Great story. There are a ton of stories in this book that can be retold and are, I think, so iconic for the era. I just want to ask you about 2 more. I'll start off with the diamond hoax, because that seems a really interesting case where he doesn't lose his shirt, really. But, there's this really massive fraud that's going on, and it seems like minors should know better. But can you tell us about the diamond hoax and how George Hearst is involved?
Yeah, certainly. So it's 1872, and this was a massive hoax that took in some of the experts in their fields. What happened is a couple grifters from the South came into San Francisco in 1872, and they went to the Bank of California, and they roped in William C. Ralston, who was the president of the Bank of California. They roped in William Lent, who was a friend of George Hearst's, and whose son, Eugene Lent, would become a good friend of William Randolph Hearst. And they convinced them that, okay, we've got this bag of diamonds. We used to have 2, but one of them, we were crossing a river and it dropped into it. And we know the location of this secret diamond mine. And everyone was like, oh, wow, they've got this diamond mine. And George Hearst hears about this. And George Hearst is persona non grata with the Bank of California at the time. He owes them over $2,000 and they want their money back. And this is one of the sections in George Hearst's life where he's totally broke. He owes $100,000 to his millionaire capitalist buddies, Lloyd Tevis and James B. Hagen. And they have staked Hearst, but Hearst hasn't produced for them, and they've lost a bunch of money, and they're giving Hearst just like one last chance to make a fortune. So Hearst hears about this secret diamond mine that these 2 guys won't say exactly where they are because they want to get paid for the information. Anyways, they go to New York City to Charles Tiffany, who, of course, Tiffany Diamonds, and he is the leading expert in the field. And they say, okay, are these diamonds legitimate? And he looks at them, spends a couple days, and he says, oh, yeah, these diamonds, it's like $100,000 easy. So everyone starts licking their chops. Meanwhile, Hearst is now on the set. He is getting maps of the West, and he has moved to Salt Lake City because he figures like, okay, people are saying the diamond mine might be in Arizona, it might be in Colorado territory. So he wants to stay kind of centrally located. He's paying prospectors to, go out and search for these diamond mines. It turns out it's, I believe, what is now present day Colorado. They get to the so-called diamond mine, and it's a field. And it turns out that, okay, yeah, there's like, after a bunch of searching, they find all these diamonds, and everyone is really happy. George Hearst has his guys come out a little later to look at him. And Clarence King, who, other than George Hearst, was considered probably the best mine appraiser in the United States, he comes out and looks at them as well. And Clarence King can't believe what he sees. He says, or a friend of his comes up and says, "My God, this diamond mine is amazing. Not only does it produce diamonds, it provides cut diamonds." And it turns out once people look at them, they're like, "Oh yeah, these are sort of like old friends. These are South African diamonds." The grifters, they end up with something like $100,000 for their trouble and disappear from history. And the rest of them, they all end up with a bunch of mud on their faces, and they end up horribly in debt from this. Hearst, however, he gets the inside information, and there's a silver lining to his story. He makes a fortune shorting the markets in San Francisco because he knows that the diamonds are worthless. And what ends up a little better for him, and turns out a lot better, is because he's located around Salt Lake City, he decides he's going to go prospecting while he's there. And he goes into what is now Park City, the ski resort, and some people have what they call the Ontario mine. And he looks at it. His friends don't think it's any good, but he spends like a week or so there. He buys it for $30,000, and it turns into the biggest silver mine in the United States. And ironically, had it not been for the Great Diamond Hoax, he might not have had the opportunity.
The other big story that we have to talk about, because I think it's so iconic in this period, is anything that's going on around Deadwood in the Dakota Territory. And Hearst plays a part in the sort of development of Deadwood as a mining village, and I guess really as a town or a village, however you want to call it. I mean, it's not a big place, but tell us a little bit about who he interacts with there and how he becomes a sort of gold baron of the city.
Well, let's see. It's 1874 when Custer and the 7th Cavalry discover gold, though people knew it was there. They kind of verify that gold was there. And okay, Hearst wants to get there, but then George Armstrong Custer and portions of the 7th Cavalry wiped out the Battle of the Little Bighorn, June 1876. And by the time the news gets to Washington, everybody is in Washington because it is the centennial. It's like, it's 1876. That's the place to be. And then there's this, my God, this, terrible catastrophe that happens in the Black Hills. So everyone knows that the army is going to come in. Hearst wants to get there. And for years, he's kind of trying to send his prospectors there, and they won't go because they don't want to get in the middle of this tussle. Hearst finally has gotten word that, okay, yeah, it's a good thing, and he's going to go there himself. Now, by the time he gets there, it's still an illegal place to be. This is not Dakota territory. This is still like disputed land. But he gets into there, and he's initially seen as an invader. People have been there before him, and they don't like the looks of this rich Californian coming in and trying to buy up their gold mines, when they know, like, hey, this looks like the biggest gold strike we have ever seen. This dwarfs, the California gold rush. Now, at the time, Hearst has got the capital that he can come in and he can transform a town. So a lot of people actually like the idea of Hearst, because when Hearst rolls in, that means suddenly you're going to have trains. Suddenly you're going to have schools and merchants, like you're going to have all the trappings of civilization. You're going to have jobs and economy. But for the people that are on the ground, they don't like the looks of him. And when Hearst wants something, he wants it very aggressively, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. He's ultimately going to attract dozens of lawsuits, and then the shootings happen. Now, in the show Deadwood, which is a terrific show and breathed new life into George Hearst. George Hearst is the villain of the show. Though he's not that bad in real life, there was an incident that happens where, yeah, it does look like George Hearst is the villain. So what happens is Hearst has bought the Homestake mine, and that is the big gold mine. That is the best, and it's still around today, not as a gold mine, but they fired neutrinos in it. It's so big and it's so deep that they're doing wonderful stuff. The Pride of the West mine and the Homestake mine overlap a little bit, and there's going to be a bit of a tussle on who controls it. So one day, the Pride of the West mine storm in to the office of Samuel McMasters, who Hearst has running the Homestake mine, and they have a written decease order, and McMasters isn't going to play nice. You know, he's sneering at him. He says, "You needn't bring a regiment," because they brought some policemen with them to make sure they weren't going to be hurt. McMasters storms over to the mine, and he's trying to, like, they've boarded up part of like a mine shaft, and he's removing the boards. And some of the Pride of the West mine, you know, pull pistols, and you know, they chase McMasters off, and then McMasters comes back with 4 or 5 of his own gunmen. And now we've got Hearst men versus Pride of the West men, and there's a standoff, and one of the Hearst gunmen shoots a young man named Alex Frankenberg in the neck, and Frankenberg dies shortly afterwards. The Hearst men are arrested, and now there's a murder trial. Hearst is in San Francisco at the time, but he obviously knows he's got to come back to preside over this. It comes out, and the judge of the murder trial, he is outraged that it appears Hearst has bribed members of the jury to swing things Hearst's way. So the 3 guys, Hearst men, that are on trial for murder are set free. And the judge doesn't like it, and he castigates the entire jury, and he has all their names stricken from the official record. No one likes Hearst at this point because they see that he's just a guy who can get away with murder, who thinks that the laws that are written can be overwritten through his capital, and it's not like they're incorrect, you know. And it's one of those aspects where the George Hearst in the show and the George Hearst in real life do have a number of similarities.
It's a remarkable story. I totally understand why producers would want to dramatize George Hearst in Deadwood. It makes for great television. Where do you think his legacy lands? I mean, we started this conversation talking about prospecting. It moved to friendships like with Mark Twain, to horse, you know, he was buying horses and took up horse racing as a hobby, to being in the Senate. What is George Hearst's legacy?
Well, George Hearst wouldn't have liked it because of his competitive nature. Though I don't think he would have absolutely hated it because he was a loving father. George Hearst's legacy ended up being William Randolph Hearst. He gave birth to the dragon, right? He set the kid on the path, you know, and taught him, like, this is the way to be, to accumulate wealth and power. And George Hearst himself was a little bit more of a simple guy and didn't know what to do with the power he had, you know, and really was more interested in acquiring political capital than spending it. But that wasn't the case with little Willie. And that's why oftentimes you don't hear much about George Hearst. When you read the biographies of the Hearst family, they're almost always on William Randolph Hearst. And they devote scant pages to George Hearst because the kid overwhelms the story. You know, the kid became William Randolph Hearst lived for 88 years. He was born shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg, and he lived 6 years after the nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan. He was an integral part and lived through the heart of the American story. If it wasn't that his legacy was actually mildly eclipsed by his son, it would be that he helped establish the American West as we see it. He somewhat built the American West. Now, if he hadn't done it, if there had been no George Hearst, yes, we eventually still would have had trains going through Deadwood and Virginia City and all of these places. But he probably did it a little faster. He probably did it with kind of the American joie de vivre of, like a do-it-yourself mentality of not quite a rags to riches story, but very well could have been, and almost became a quintessential character that you could see Mark Twain writing about. I say in the book, into the legacy portion, that he is a wild and vibrant patch of the American crazy quilt, like silver and gold and stained with whiskey. He seems to have a lot of the aspects of the quintessential American in him.
Great. I mean, the other thing that I wanted to ask you about in terms of legacy was his wife, who seems to be a really important activist after he passes away, a philanthropist and a feminist, and certainly before her time, I would have thought. Would you agree? Or, I mean, how do you see Phoebe's legacy?
She has a spectacular story. When she and little William Randolph Hearst are touring Germany, she looks in on the school systems, on the university, and she thinks, okay, this is the way to do it. And she's one of the people that really spearheads the kindergarten movement in the United States. She establishes many kindergartens throughout San Francisco. Her philanthropy is amazing. She actually helps Martha's Vineyard, and George Washington was her favorite president, and she becomes the first regent at first female regent at UC Berkeley, and does everything she can to pave the way for women's rights and particularly education rights. She's a little bit ahead of her time, just as George in his politics was a little bit behind his time. Later on, she was always a little bit horrified about what her son was doing. At the same time, she was extraordinarily loving, and there must have been some pride as well. Now, she could keep William Randolph Hearst in check a little bit. George had never want anything built on his beloved Camp Hill in San Simeon, where he would camp, or where William Randolph Hearst and George Hearst would camp. Once Phoebe passed, William Randolph Hearst said, okay, now's the time. And that's when he started construction on what became known as Hearst Castle. So she was able to put him in check just a little bit. And when William Randolph Hearst wanted to get married early on, none of his potential wives were good enough for Phoebe. Phoebe believed that her son should be marrying English royalty. She had a little bit of that part of her personality as well.
Remarkable story, Matt. I definitely have a new impression of, a brand new impression, because I didn't really have much of an impression of George Hearst outside of that of his son. And I think what we get from this book is a multifaceted, multi-perspective, because it's not just the family history that we've been looking at. It's really his business partners, his friends, and also the politicians that he did battle with in Washington. It's a really great book.
Well, that's all we have time for.
A great service for the Gilded Age and Progressive Era.
You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.